Hello everyone, this is Ram Kumar Notat. I'm a senior solutions architect focusing on data and analytics at AWS. Today, the topic of discussion is enabling agility with data governance on AWS. Let's get started. So in the agenda, what we will do is we will talk about some of the customer challenges and asks we are seeing from the various segment of customers. Um, Then we will talk about the real meat of the presentation, which is how you can implement data governance using AWS services. And we will wrap up the session with a little bit details on how you can get started, what are the programs that are available, which helps you to get started with data governance in your organization. Okay, so being data driven is something that every organization is trying to do. But when it comes to data driven or being data driven, there are many challenges. And one, of course, we all know that the data is growing exponentially, and there is so much diversity in the type of data that we are getting. Various types of data, right? So earlier it used to be just structured. Now you name it, there are so many different types out there and different velocity out there where you need to process that and put governance in place for that. Now, the other challenge is a lot of organizations are in the path of moving the data from their on-prem systems onto the cloud. So the data is spread across various on-prem and cloud infrastructure, or even within that, you may have some data lakes, data warehouses. There are various types of sources where data is stored, which is adding the complexity. And in addition to all of these things, for sure, there are security and compliance requirements we need to adhere to. And sometimes what we feel is that the lack of alignment with the business initiative is another challenge for organizations to be data driven. Now, again, when we talk about being data driven, one thing that um, we see with the various customers is while the type of data that they are dealing with, the business problems that they are trying to solve could be different across various customers, there are some themes that we keep hearing from our customers. Let's take a look at that. The first and foremost is understanding what great looks like. That in itself is a challenge for a lot of organizations. And what we'll do is we'll talk about how we can help with all these various challenges or the themes that we are seeing across, right? And once you know what is that great looks like, that's when you start identifying a use case, prioritizing that, and you need to have a business case, because only then you will have a sponsorship associated with it. So those are the three major themes that are aligned from a use case and what it looks like and things like that. The bottom row that you are seeing there is more towards the how-to part of it. Basically, now that you have a business case, how do you make sure that data driven themes are implemented in your organization? First and foremost is having that data driven culture, and in some cases there could be some gaps. It could be the skills, it could be the technologies. Like today we will be discussing a lot of AWS services that you can use in your journey. So knowing about those services and enabling yourself and your teams on those services, and of course, when it comes to all of these things, we want to make sure that all the compliance and governance is taken care. Now, we started our discussion saying that, hey, today's discussion is data governance, but for the last couple of minutes, we have been talking about data driven. Now, how are these two interrelated, right? So let's take a look at this. The stats from IDC says that 85% of businesses want to be data driven, and only 37 of them have been successful. Now, why is this number important? Because IDC also states that the absence of efficient data governance becomes an inhibitor to the success, and many times they spend 30% of their time uh, getting wasted in governance because uh, there are no process in place, there is no automation in place how you can easily implement data governance. That's where customers struggle, and many a times we hear from customers that they even feel difficult to define what data governance is. And let's take a look at one such definition, right? So this is a definition from our side, but there could be many other definitions for data governance. So data governance is the collection of policies, processes, and systems that organizations use to ensure the quality and appropriate handling of their data throughout its life cycle for the purpose of generating business value. Now, I want to highlight a couple of keywords from there. One is the policies, process, and the systems, right? And the other one is handling the data. But the most important part in that whole definition is the business value, because data governance starts with business value. The reason why we are stressing on that is if you don't have a business case identified, it is highly likely that when you try to implement something, you may not be successful, because data driven companies who wants to implement data governance starts with the business. So let's look at how this all spans out, right? So you start from the business strategy, so you know that, hey, this is what I want to implement. And once you know what is the business strategy that you want to implement, then there will be a set of people who wants to work on that, and they will say that, hey, I want so and so data so that I can meet this business strategy. So that's where your business case and the need for the data to satisfy that business case comes into picture. So they are called consumers of that data because they consume the data and then produce a final output which can implement the business strategy. Now, once consumers know that, or at least have an idea that, hey, this is the type of data that I'm looking for, or these could be some of the fields that I'm looking for, then they will let the producers know that, hey, these are all the data assets that I want. These are all the data sets that I want, fields that I want, so that our team can go and implement that business strategy. Now, how do we make sure that the data from the data producers are moving to consumers? That's where data governance comes into picture. And when we bring in data governance, if you look at the various steps involved in the whole cycle, I'll split this into maybe the top half and the bottom half, because see, the when the data gets ingested, so the data is coming from the producers and it gets ingested, you need to make sure that there is automation when you try to ingest the data. And you need to have data classification, you need to have data profiling, data quality, you need to secure and store the data. With all these things, what you're essentially doing is you are able to catalog that data and easily share that data with the various consumers. Now, all the various steps that are listed there are the steps involved in making sure that there is a good governance in place so that you can have the data cataloged and shared with the various consumers. Now, those consumers, what they will do is they will pick that data and they may bring in data from various such producers and come up with their insights, and they make that data available for the rest of the enterprise or maybe to their customers. So at that point in time, that consumers will take the role of a producer, and the cycle continues, right? So that's where the bottom side of the chain, where again those consumers, when they create the data products that they want to share with maybe their business execs or with other teams or with their external customers, when they do that, again the same set of data curation, integration, lineage, security, life cycle, all of those comes into picture. So that the moment when that consumers also act as a producers, that's when the concept of data mesh also comes into picture, which we will talk about a little bit more in detail in our session. Now, we talked about these are all the various steps involved in bringing in data governance, but let's take a look at how we are going to implement that using AWS services. Which all services can help you do that? Let's take a look at that. Now, if I look at the the various activities that we discussed in the previous previous slide, I would categorize into the activities into three different sections. One is automating data ingestion, classification, and data quality. The other one is managing data catalogs. And the third one is how can you share the data to the consumers? How can you easily share the data to the consumers? So if you look at the various AWS services that are listed there, when it comes to the automating the data ingestion, classification, quality, you can see that Amazon Airflow, Glue, Amazon Macy, AWS Lake Formation, all these services can help with. Same is the case with the data catalogs. We'll talk about AWS Glue as well as Data Zone when it comes to that section. And we will also talk about how the various services like Lake Formation, Redshift, Data Exchange, and Data Zone help you with the data sharing activities. Now, let's take the first section itself, right? So, automating the data governance on ingestion. If you look at it, that is it is pretty hard to do this with the traditional architecture because of various reasons. One, the data in the data lake is consistently updating, or any whether it's on-prem or cloud. Anytime you are trying to build a data lake, it keeps it changes constantly, right? And you can have various types of data that is coming in. It could be streaming data that comes in, or it could be SaaS applications that is bringing in the data, or it could be various databases. And even from databases, it could be your CDC data that is coming in, which brings all the changes that are happening. So there are so many ways in which the data is trickling in into your data lake. So that's one challenge. And the second one is the inconsistent formats that you are seeing. Because, for example, let's say if you are bringing in streaming data, what that means in most of the cases is you have like very small records, but huge number of them. Whereas, let's say if you are doing a migration from a big data store, you may have huge files, but with smaller number of files. And even in the format of the data also varies a lot. Some of them could be in Parquet, some of them could be in CSV or JSON or many other formats. And the challenge with those variable formats is you need to make sure that the performance is consistent, the reusability of your data, and the data quality checks that you are planning to put in place. So you need to have a way how you can standardize some of those things, and which we will take a look at it a little bit more in detail how we can tackle that. The other challenge that we are seeing when it comes to the automating the ingestion, data governance on ingestion, is the complying with the regulations. Basically, as and when the data is coming in, what if you want to put some classification, do some classification of your data, or PII tagging of your data, or applying the policies based on the type of classification that you have. So those are some of the other challenges, because it could be the various regulations like GDPR, which you need to adhere to, so that you want to put in all these policies and governance in place. So take a typical example here. So in this example, we are assuming that the source is a SaaS source like Salesforce. So to bring in the data from the various SaaS sources, you have Amazon App Flow. And again, going back to the previous slide, the point that we were discussing in the previous slide, there are so many different ways in which you can get the data, right? And here in this diagram, we are just picking an example of one such use case. And you can do this with various other sources as well. So here we are using Amazon App because the source that we have is a SaaS, which is Salesforce here. And from using Amazon App you are landing the data onto S3. Now, once the data lands on S3, the other challenge that you may have is uh, once you bring in all the data into your data lake, you need to have an easy mechanism to figure out what is the structure of that data. So for that, you're using crawler to crawl the data, put a structure to it, and you're also using glue to classify and do the profiling and making sure that the quality of the data is fine. And once you have all those things in place, you have your cleansed bucket or your data asset which is already gone through that process, which goes into your glue data catalog, which is your technical metadata, and you use lake formation to put in access based on the tags that are defined. It could be based on the PII information that you have. It could be based on various lines of businesses that you may have, the various tags that you have, and then have that data sharing created using lake formation. So this is one flow end to end. But let's look at some of the aspects when it comes to the data ingestion, classification, and quality, right? So on the left hand side, you can see that there is data classification, data profiling, data quality, then moves into the secure, store, encrypt, and catalog. So let's see the some of these services in detail on how you can implement this. One of the recent announcements that came in 2022 reInvent is AWS Glue data quality. So with AWS Glue data quality, it's a feature that automatically measures, monitors, and manages data quality in your data lakes and data pipelines. Basically, it reduces the manual data analysis and rule identification efforts from day to hours, and it eliminates the manual data statistical analysis or rule writing or code development to bring in that data quality. And let's take a look of let's take a look at the other aspects of the automation of governance in the ingestion, right? So one is data quality we just looked at, and the advantage with the glue data quality is there are various places or stages in which you can bring in that data quality. For example, if you look at this diagram, you can bring that data quality in at a catalog level where you have your data. You just go into a specific data asset that is listed in glue data catalog, and you can run data quality checks on that. Or you can have the data quality checks as and when the data is coming into your data lake. So you can have the data quality check implemented either during the pipeline or on the data assets that you already have on your data lake, or the data the locations that you have. So that's glue data quality, right? Let's look at the other aspects as well. We talked about PII identification, for example, right? So when the data comes in, Glue has an option to identify the PII data in your data that you are processing, the various data assets that you have. And similarly, once you bring all that data in, what you do is you push, you run through all the PI identification and enable the quality checks, and then move that data into the data lakes. So when you move that data into the data lakes, what that really means is you have that cleansed data, but how will the producers get to know that, hey, this is what is the data out there? That's where the cataloging comes into picture, right? So it's the the cataloging is so important that it has it makes the data available for consumers to search and identify what is the data asset that they want to consume. Now, when we talk about catalog, it could be a technical metadata catalog, which is what we are seeing here, right, in this slide itself, in the middle, where you have all your data assets, the technical metadata of that data assets cataloged right there in the Glue data catalog. Or it could be business metadata catalog, where you are defining what a particular field means to that organization. So the cataloging can be in two different aspects, from a business standpoint as well as from a technical standpoint. So with Glue, you can use Glue to ingest the data from the various sources by using the connectors. Then you can use crawlers to go through the data assets and catalog that into your Glue data catalog from a technical metadata standpoint. And you can also do the PII identification, data profiling, data quality, implement all those things and put the data back into data lakes or data warehouse. And even at that point, you again go back and catalog those cleansed data into your technical metadata catalog. So all of that is good. But one piece that is missing here is the business metadata catalog. So how do we get that into the technical metadata catalog or the governance piece? That's where Amazon Data Zone comes into picture. So Amazon Data Zone is a product which helps data producers and data consumers collaborate easily by making the data sharing so seamless with data governance. So if I look at the various pillars within Data Zone, one is the business metadata catalog. That was one of the challenges that we were discussing earlier. The second one is, see, in the organization, the typical challenge is the consumers are not having the ability to explore the data that they want. So that's where the self-service portal comes into picture. And you need to have a simplified access of the various data assets and the teams together. And that's where the the groups, the data projects and the group teams and all of those things come into picture. But we will focus more towards the first and the last, which is the business data catalog and the governed data sharing aspect of it. Because from a data governance standpoint, those are the two things that typically a lot of customers are facing challenges with. Now, when it comes to the governed data sharing, Data Zone helps you to use all the constructs that are already out there. For example, we talked about a service called Lake Formation, which can help you in enable data sharing and as well as uh, controlling the access to the various data assets. So you can, behind the scenes, Amazon Data Zone uses Lake Formation to do all of that and in a governed way. So it makes your data sharing a lot seamless. So that's where Data Zone comes into picture. Now, let's talk a little bit about data sharing aspect of it, right? When it comes to data sharing, while Amazon Data Zone acts as a wrapper to easily enable the data sharing using a self-service portal, behind the scenes, we have seen is customers use various types of data sharing using Lake Formation. So behind the scenes, it uses Lake Formation. So let's take a look at the various patterns that we see customers are using when it comes to data sharing with Lake Formation. One is a very simple form of it where you have Lake Formation and you have a single account strategy, and the Lake Formation shares the access to the various consumers. The next one is a hub and spoke model, which is pretty common. And there you have one producer account and you have Lake Formation, which will um, help you to provide the right access to the various consumers that you may have. So that's the hub and spoke model. And if you remember in the very beginning when we were talking through the data governance and the the various life cycle and the various activities that we perform in that producer to consumer data life cycle, right? One thing that we discussed was, hey, what happens when a consumer start acting as a producer as well? So that's where many times the data mesh concept comes into picture, and that's where the central governance comes into picture. And of course, there are cases where you have business to business data sharing that happens to the external customers using lake formation as well. So these are the various patterns that we have seen across. But now, why are we saying that lake formation makes things easy when it comes to data sharing? How does that permissioning model works? Let's take a detailed look at that. Why that is becoming a lot easy with lake formation. Now, lake formation permission model is uh, is a DB style fine grained permission on your data catalog resources. Now, these permissions apply across the data lake stack. So what that means is you are putting the access control in one place. You are doing the access control at one place using lake formation, and the various services. For example, in this diagram, what you're seeing is you're putting the access control using lake formation on your data lake, and you have QuickSight or AWS Glue or Amazon Athena or Amazon EMR, Redshift, SageMaker, and there are so many third-party services that are integrating with lake formation. So all of that adhere to that permissions, honor that permission model that has been done by lake formation. So you set the access at one place and you use various services to access that data, but all of them comes through lake formation and honor those permissions. So that way you don't have to go and set it up at way too many places. And uh, the one another aspect of it is it's pretty easy to audit the permissions because you are setting the permissions at one place, right? So you clearly knows who has access to what. So that auditability is another key factor to it. Now, the second bullet out there talks about scaling the permission management using a tag-based access control. Now, why is that a challenge? When I had talked to the various customers, especially who customers who has several tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of data assets and similar number of users, what happens is if you have to manage the access at a resource level, basically at the data asset level, it becomes too cumbersome because you're talking about so many different permutations and combinations, right? So that's where the tag-based access control comes into picture. Now let's take a look at how that tag-based access control work. So when it comes to tag-based access control, we can define tags at various levels. We can assign many different tags. For example, it could be the various departments like sales, marketing, and so on and so forth, the various lines of businesses, um, or it could be based on the classification of data that you have, like sensitive, non-sensitive, or any PII classification or PHI classifications, right? So you can have all those different tags that are assigned to the various assets. So before assigning, the first activity is defining a tag ontology, right? So first you define the tag ontology, and once you have that tag ontology, you can start assigning the tags to the various data assets, and it could be at the various levels. Like we can have it at a database level or table column, so the various levels. Now, once you have defined the tags at whatever granularity that you want, then you start assigning those tags or providing access to those tags to the various IAM users, roles, or groups, right? Like basically AD users and groups. So what that means is tomorrow, if you are adding a new data asset, you don't need to worry about giving access to, or making sure that the access is only to the right people out of the maybe 100,000 employees that you have in your organization. But all you need to worry about is to make sure that you are tagging that resource appropriately, so that whoever has access to that tags, only they will be able to access those data assets. So that's advantage of tag-based access control. And organizations who are going in the path of who has a lot of data assets and a lot of users, we strongly recommend using a tag-based access control instead of specific resource-based access controls, because that is much more scalable and will be a lot more easy to manage in the world. All right. Now, all the things that we talked about, or the especially when we were talking about the lake formation, permissioning, and things like that earlier, the what used to happen is uh, these are all uh, the data storage used to be just on S3, right? Now with the reinvent that happened late 2022, in this the last reinvent, we announced another feature where now you can do lake formation data sharing, or you can govern the data access to the Redshift data shares using lake formation. So what that means is the Redshift was already out there, which a lot of customers were using Redshift for doing data sharing, because that's one of the most loved features I've seen from a Redshift standpoint, where they are easily able to share the data with the various users or various lines of business and things like that using Redshift data shares. Now, with the reinvent, now the advantage is you can govern that access using lake formation. So the governance of the data that is sitting on your S3 data lake was already out there. Now you also have an option to govern your Redshift data shares using lake formation. And in reinvent, we also announced uh, lake formation able to manage the data that you are subscribing from AWS Data Exchange, for example. So that's a third-party data. So AWS Data Exchange is a service where you can subscribe or act as a producer if you want, or a provider if you want, to get access to the third-party data. So there are a lot of organizations who make use of third-party data along with their first party data today, right? And AWS Data Exchange is a place where you can look for and subscribe various data products. Now, with the new announcement that came out in the last year reInvent, AWS Lake Formation will now be able to manage the permissions for the data shares that you are getting from the third-party data that is coming through Data Exchange. Now, look at it this way: you already had the flexibility to do that with S3 Data Lake. Now you can also do that for your data warehouse, the Redshift data shares, and you can have the same governance that you can do for your first party data for your third party data as well. So now you have one single place where you can do all of your data governance, and all these various tools, whether it's lake formation, whether it's Redshift data sharing, or your AWS data exchange, all of this can make your data sharing so easy as well. And in addition to all of these things, now you have Data Zone, which can do the data sharing with governance using a UI as well. So that's where AWS services comes into picture to solve the data governance challenges that our customers are having. Now let's take a look at how you can get started, right? So there are various programs that can support you to bring in data governance in your organization. One is a program called Data Driven Everything. So if you want to think big, come up with the big ideas. And if you remember the very first challenge that we were talking about, what great looks like, maybe yeah, that's what this fits in, right? So to figure out, have that thinking hat and figuring out what is that you want to get to, and then you can use data lab where you have an idea, you can come with that idea, leave with a solution, right? So the data labs can be for your designs or for the build, and there is always an option to scale that activities that you are using with the professional services. So those are the three programs, and what we suggest is think big with either a discovery workshop or a data driven everything program, and but start small. Like pick a use case, try out a POC, maybe with the professional services or maybe using data labs, for example, right? Try that out to see how it's working, and is this what you want? And once you know that yes, this looks like what we are looking for, then scale fast. And there are partners, there is professional services that you can help with. So that's a journey that we recommend and we have seen working really well for our customers. So hope you all enjoyed this session and it was helpful. And thank you so much. Thanks for your time. This is Ramkumar Notat, and here is my email address and LinkedIn handle. So if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.